When I went to bed that night, something unusual happened. I felt hungry. The night had grown late while I worked, and I'd forgotten that I had declined dinner at my wife's suggestion. With her already asleep, the hunger gnawed at me. I decided to head to the kitchen and get something to eat. As I moved, I heard loud voices coming from the home of our neighbor, Malvi Nazimuddin. Startled, I looked toward their house. This had never happened before. I had never heard loud arguments from their home. What could be going on at this late hour? Concerned, I approached the wall separating our homes. The voices grew clearer. It sounded like a heated discussion between Malvi Nazimuddin and his wife. Normally, I would consider it unethical to eavesdrop, but the conversation was so strange that I couldn't help but listen. Their words were puzzling. I couldn't understand what issue might be troubling them. Their household had always been a beacon of unity and trust. What could possibly have gone wrong? But the argument only intensified. This was the first time I had ever heard the usually gentle imam raise his voice. He was known for his calm demeanor, always staying clear of conflicts in the neighborhood. I had a lot of respect for him. He was a straightforward, kind man. Over the years, our families had developed a warm rapport. My wife and his wife often visited each other, always in proper attire. Their household was one of modesty and order, never a hint of discord. Of course, like any neighbors, we occasionally had minor disagreements, but we always resolved them quietly. Never once had there been any shouting or vulgar language, but tonight was different. The unusual noise coming from their home left me confused and concerned. I wondered if someone was unwell or if something serious had happened. In the end, I decided not to linger and went to the kitchen. I had my meal, went back to bed, and soon drifted off to sleep. Since I was a school teacher and it was my day off, I had planned to take care of household chores and sleep in late. I settled into bed, ready for a long rest. Around 7 in the morning, my wife shook me awake. I groggily opened my eyes, surprised to see her waking me so early. She knew I liked to sleep in on my day off, so what could be so urgent? She looked visibly distressed. Rubbing my eyes, I motioned for her to explain. "Get up, Ayaz," she said, her voice filled with worry. "There's fighting coming from Malvi Sahib's house again. I don't know what's going on." It seemed like the entire night's events had stirred up more than just restlessness. The issue with Malvi Sahib's household clearly wasn't resolved, and now my wife's insistence on getting involved was starting to wear on me. At first, I tried to discourage her, reasoning that it wasn't appropriate to pry into our neighbors' personal matters. "This is their problem," I told her. "They'll sort it out themselves. We shouldn't interfere. It could upset Malvi Sahib." Reluctantly, she left the room, but I could sense her unease. Her curiosity was as persistent as ever. I hoped she'd drop the subject, but a short while later she came back and woke me up again. This time her concern was palpable. She told me she had heard crying from their house and suspected something was very wrong. "I think Nasreen Babhi is crying," she said. "Should I go find out what's going on?" At that moment, I wasn't sure how to respond. I gestured for her to go if she felt she must, and I lay back down. I wasn't keen on getting involved in something that might turn out to be a private family matter. However, I couldn't entirely dismiss the possibility that something serious was happening, especially if she was hearing cries from next door. After a while, my wife returned. This time, she shook me awake more urgently. "I just spoke with Nasreen Babhi," she whispered. "She's crying because Malvi Sahib is planning to marry someone else." Her words were both shocking and puzzling. I couldn't believe it. Malvi Sahib? The same man who had always been a model of calm and respect? It didn't fit the image I had of him. When I asked her if she'd heard this from Malvi Sahib himself, she admitted that he wasn't home. Only Nasreen Babhi had been there, distraught and sharing her side of the story. I couldn't help but wonder if this was all based on a misunderstanding or an unfounded suspicion. It seemed unlikely that a man of Malvi Sahib's character would act so rashly. Still, I chose not to press the matter. My wife's account didn't feel conclusive. People's lives are complex, and until I heard it directly from Malvi Sahib, I wasn't prepared to jump to any conclusions. I decided it was best to stay out of it for the time being. That evening, when I went to the mosque for the Maghrib prayer, I noticed Malvi Sahib's face looked unusually strained. I didn't need to ask. His expression revealed his inner turmoil. He finished leading the prayer and left almost immediately afterward, unlike his usual routine of staying back for a while to chat with the congregation. I wanted to stop him and ask what was troubling him, but I held back. It wasn't my place to intrude. So I returned home, still puzzled, but willing to let time bring clarity to the situation. While we were eating, my wife brought it up again. I mentioned that yes, Malvi Sahib seemed visibly distressed earlier, though I wasn't sure what the issue might be. At the time, I thought it was just a minor problem, but it turned out to be far more serious than I could have imagined. The next day, an incident unfolded that shed new light on the situation. I was returning home from work that afternoon under the intense summer heat. The streets were unusually quiet. As I turned into my lane, I noticed a small gathering of people outside Malvi Sahib's house. Surprised, I hesitated for a moment before making my way closer. Something felt off. Why were all these people here? As I approached, I could hear raised voices from inside the house. The women outside seemed engrossed, and a couple of men who had apparently stopped by out of curiosity were standing there as well. I decided to ask one of them what was going on, while in the background, I could hear Malvi Sahib's wife yelling. The entire scene was unusual. In such heat, everyone stood outside, absorbed by the commotion. When I asked about the issue, one of my neighbors, Gafur, pulled me aside. His expression was serious, and he seemed eager to share some significant news. "You're Malvi Sahib's neighbor, aren't you? Don't you know what's happening?" he asked. When I shook my head, he leaned in closer and whispered, "Malvi Nazimuddin has taken a second wife. That's why there's such a ruckus. His first wife found out, and they're fighting inside." Hearing this, I was taken aback. This contradicted what my wife had mentioned earlier, that Malvi Sahib was considering remarriage. According to Gafur, it had already happened. I was stunned, but I didn't feel it was my place to get involved. I nodded and walked back toward my house, looking forward to some rest. By evening, word had spread throughout the neighborhood. Everyone was talking about Malvi Nazimuddin's second marriage. Though he hadn't officially addressed the matter, his demeanor spoke volumes. Each time he came to lead prayers, his face showed signs of worry, and his silence hinted at the truth. At that time, I was about 17 years old. The mosque's regular imam, Malvi Faraz, was widely respected in our area. Known for his piety and wisdom, Malvi Faraz had only one daughter, Nasreen. A well-regarded figure in the community, he would lead prayers and teach Quranic lessons to local boys at the nearby madrasa. When he fell ill, he decided to marry his daughter to one of his madrasa students, a quiet, well-mannered young orphan whom Malvi Faraz spoke highly of. As I reflected on Malvi Nazimuddin's situation, I couldn't help but recall Malvi Faraz's example. A man of integrity, he was known for making thoughtful decisions that earned the respect of everyone in the community. Whatever the truth about Malvi Nazimuddin's second marriage, only he knew the full story. For now, I had no choice but to stay out of it and let time reveal what was really going on. It was well known in the neighborhood that Malvi Faraz was a deeply respected figure. When he became ill, he made a remarkable decision. He married his only daughter to one of his madrasa students, Nazimuddin. Malvi Faraz not only took this orphaned student under his wing, but also gave him a home and entrusted him with the responsibility of leading the mosque after his passing. This act earned him even greater admiration within the community. People felt that Malvi Faraz's choice was a wise one, as Nazimuddin proved to be a gentle, fair, and responsible imam. Nazimuddin's calm demeanor and ability to peacefully resolve disputes made him well-loved. He never meddled unnecessarily or imposed his authority on others, and this approach endeared him to the residents. He was regarded as a model imam and led a harmonious married life. However, there was one peculiar habit of his that raised some eyebrows. Every Saturday after Zuhr prayers, he would leave the neighborhood and not return until Sunday morning for Fajr prayers. While no one knew where he went and he never explained, this routine persisted from the day he became imam. Because it was part of his personal life, people refrained from questioning it directly. Nonetheless, it remained a point of quiet curiosity. Nazimuddin claimed he had no living relatives. Both his parents had passed away, and he never mentioned any family connections. The question of where he went on Saturday afternoons and stayed overnight lingered in people's minds, though they chose not to interfere. This pattern might have gone unnoticed forever, but one day, rumors began to spread. Some claimed that Nazimuddin had been married before, others insisted he had just recently remarried. These whispers intensified, and the arguments between Nazimuddin and his wife seemed to lend them credibility. One evening, while another heated exchange was underway at their home, something happened that shocked everyone. During the argument, Nazimuddin shouted, "Yes, yes, I did get married. So what? Do whatever you want." His voice echoed through the house, followed by a sudden, heavy silence. My wife and I glanced at each other, stunned. What followed was a flurry of speculation. How had he managed to marry so quickly, especially since he rarely left the neighborhood apart from his weekly outings? Where had he met someone? Had his mysterious Saturday trips been tied to this secret marriage all along? These questions swirled, but answers remained elusive. All anyone knew was that the imam they once admired had introduced an unexpected, deeply personal twist to his story. Malvi Sahib had 2 young daughters, and the household was a picture of happiness, until it seemed that happiness came under some sort of shadow. Since Malvi Sahib himself had confirmed the news, people in the neighborhood speculated for a few days before gradually falling silent. Most believed that his decision to take a second wife was influenced by his clerical disposition, a step permissible under Islamic law and not something to be debated endlessly. As for the domestic quarrels that followed, the general sentiment was that these were personal issues, best left to the family to resolve. On that particular Saturday, Malvi Sahib once again disappeared. But when he returned, he wasn't alone. This time, he brought with him a beautiful white horse. My wife told me about it that evening, mentioning that Malvi Sahib seemed to have purchased the horse recently. While tensions between Malvi Sahib and his wife still lingered, the major arguments had subsided, and a semblance of peace had returned to their home. Jokingly, I turned to my wife and remarked how Malvi Sahib seemed to be developing sudden new interests. First a second wife, and now a horse. The horse was strikingly beautiful, and many in the neighborhood admired it. People assumed it was simply a newfound hobby of his, a way to indulge a personal passion. Then, one evening, after Isha prayers, Malvi Sahib asked everyone in the mosque to stay seated. This was unusual, and it left the congregation puzzled. What could he possibly want to address? After a few minutes of silence, one of the older residents, Ubaid Sahib, broke the tension. Looking toward Malvi Sahib, he said, "Malvi Sahib, what's the matter? We've been hearing a lot of talk about you around the neighborhood these past few days. Are you here to confirm these rumors? If you've taken a second wife, let us assure you that no one here objects. Islam permits it, and it is your right. If there's something you'd like to share, feel free to speak. We stand by you." Malvi Sahib gave a faint smile, running his hand over his beard. His demeanor was noticeably strained, and it was clear from his nervous gestures that he was deeply troubled. When he finally began to speak, he started by expressing gratitude. "First of all, I thank you all for respecting me and not reacting negatively to any of the gossip surrounding me." Then he addressed the central issue. "As for the second marriage, I will not deny it. Yes, I have taken a second wife." This admission caused a stir among the attendees. People turned to each other, whispering in astonishment. Some felt Malvi Sahib had every right to do so, while others viewed it as a betrayal of Malvi Faraz's trust. They recalled how Malvi Faraz had given Malvi Nazimuddin a home and married him to his only daughter when he was an orphan with no one else to rely on. To them, this second marriage seemed a poor return for such kindness. Malvi Sahib continued, anticipating the unspoken questions. "You're probably wondering who my second wife is and where she's from. While these are personal matters, I still want to share with you all that she is currently living in my house." At this revelation, the congregation fell silent again, exchanging shocked glances. They had assumed only his first wife and daughters resided in his home. This unexpected disclosure left everyone pondering. If she had been living there, when had she arrived, and why hadn't anyone noticed before? "But Malvi Sahib, I thought only your wife and children lived in that house. Are you planning to bring your second wife home now?" Since I lived right next door, sharing a common wall, I couldn't stop myself from asking. Malvi Sahib looked at me, nodded slightly, and replied, "My wife is already with me. I brought her home just last evening." He paused, then added, "She is not a person, she is a white mare." For a moment, I felt as if I hadn't heard him correctly. It wasn't just me. Everyone in the room stared at each other, wide-eyed, as if trying to confirm what they had just heard. It seemed as though Maulvi Sahib had lost his senses. The congregation sat in stunned silence, their bewildered expressions gradually turning into knowing glances exchanged among themselves. Finally, Ubaid Sahib broke the silence again, saying, "Maulvi Sahib, what are you saying? How can you call a mayor your wife? How is that even possible?" It was the question on everyone's mind. Maulvi Sahib sighed, then said calmly, "As I have told you all, this matter is deeply personal. I prefer to keep it private, so I kindly ask that no one question me further or cast unnecessary accusations. Thank you." And with that, Maulvi Sahib walked away, leaving the congregation in a state of utter confusion. A murmur spread through the mosque as people struggled to make sense of his bizarre statement. Was this some kind of joke? No one could tell. Just as the chatter began to grow, Ubaid Sahib firmly addressed everyone, saying, "This is a mosque, and no one should engage in unnecessary arguments here. I request everyone to return to their homes." Slowly, one by one, the congregation dispersed. I too returned home, still unable to make sense of what had just happened. When I arrived, my wife immediately noticed my puzzled expression and asked what was going on. I sat her down and shared the day's events. "Nazia," I said, "did you know that Maulvi Nazimuddin has admitted to a second marriage, and that his second wife is now living in his house?" "Who told you this?" she asked, just as surprised as I was. "Maulvi Sahib himself," I replied. "And his second wife isn't a woman. It's that white mare he brought home yesterday." My wife stared at me in disbelief, covering her mouth with her hands. "How is that even possible?" she whispered. "I don't understand it either," I said. "The strangest part is that the constant arguments we used to hear from their house have suddenly stopped. Even Nasreen Babhi has gone silent. What could be behind all this?" From that day onward, Maulvi Sahib could often be seen riding his white mare around the neighborhood. The tension that once filled his home seemed to have disappeared, and he appeared entirely at ease. But the mystery remained. How could someone as respectable as Maulvi Sahib suddenly adopt such an unusual behavior? In the neighborhood, there was a flurry of talk against Maulvi Sahib. His actions had become the main topic of conversation, leaving everyone astonished. People were bewildered that such an incident could happen in their town. Some believed this was a highly immoral and disgraceful act, one that was entirely against religious principles. They feared that if this behavior wasn't stopped, it might soon become a trend, with others following suit. They reasoned that if the neighborhood imam could engage in such conduct, what could be expected of others? Some residents decided that Maulvi Sahib should be dismissed from his duties at the mosque, and that no one should pray behind him anymore. Slowly but surely, people stopped praying under his leadership. Eventually, a group of them told Maulvi Sahib outright that he was no longer welcome in the mosque. They warned him that after what he had done, no one would allow him to remain in the neighborhood, and he must leave as soon as possible. They even threatened to report him to the authorities for allegedly corrupting the community's youth. This hostile response left Maulvi Sahib deeply distressed. He tried to reason with the residents, explaining that it was his life and he had the right to live it as he saw fit. But the people had made up their minds, and their rejection of him became unyielding. His once respectable status in the community was now replaced by humiliation, with the residents unanimously agreeing that he should move out or face formal complaints against him. Whenever Maulvi Sahib went outside with his beautiful white mare, people would gather to look at it out of curiosity. The added claim that the mare was his wife created an odd atmosphere in the neighborhood. No one could fathom the secret behind his actions, but it was clear that he had made a choice that baffled even those who knew him well. I had always regarded Maulvi Sahib as someone of impeccable character. I couldn't understand how someone so upright could do something so controversial. Even if he had married the mare out of some dire necessity, how could he now continue to keep it in this way? It was baffling to think that someone who once lived with such honor would put his entire reputation on the line for a decision that seemed so inexplicable. Eventually, the community's boycott left Maulvi Sahib no choice but to leave the neighborhood. One morning, I saw him packing up all his belongings. It was a sad sight. A man who had spent his entire life earning respect was now leaving under a cloud of disgrace. My wife visited their house to see what was happening. When she returned, she told me that Nasreen Bobby, Malvi Sahib, and their children were packing up their things, and they looked deeply troubled. Nasreen Bobby remained silent, leaving me wondering about the hidden truth behind all this. That evening, I saw Malvi Sahib leaving the neighborhood. His wife and children were with him, and he was leading the white mare. I watched them go, still wrestling with the mystery that had unfolded. I couldn't help but ask him, "Where are you planning to go now?" When I heard the news that Malvi Nazimuddin was at the school, I could hardly contain my anticipation. It had been over a month since he left the neighborhood under a cloud of shame, taking his family and his controversial white mare with him. I had been eager to understand what had truly happened, to hear his side of the story and perhaps to find some closure. As I approached him after the school day ended, I saw that he looked physically worn and visibly older than before. His once vibrant demeanor had faded, and his face carried the weight of many burdens. Still, he greeted me warmly, and I could tell he was genuinely glad to see a familiar face. The sight of him stirred a mixture of emotions in me: relief that he was safe, curiosity about his current situation, and a lingering sadness for all that had transpired. Rather than inviting him home, I decided it was best to speak elsewhere, away from prying eyes and potential gossip. I took him to a small nearby cafe, where we could sit down in peace. As we settled at a corner table, I began the conversation gently, expressing how much I had missed him and how relieved I was that he had reached out. "You did the right thing by coming," I said, trying to convey my sincerity. "I was really worried about you." Malvi Nazimuddin nodded quietly, sipping his tea. "I spent so many years among you all," he said, his voice carrying a faint trace of nostalgia. "This place was more than a neighborhood to me. It was my home." I sensed that he was ready to talk but needed time to gather his thoughts. Instead of pressing him, I let the silence linger for a moment. Finally, he began to open up, recounting how the events had unfolded from his perspective. As he spoke, it became clear that the situation was far more complex than the simple rumors and accusations that had spread through the community. He admitted to mistakes, but also described the pressures and misunderstandings that had pushed him to take certain actions. While he didn't justify everything that had happened, his words painted a more nuanced picture. I couldn't help but feel compassion for him, even as I recognized the gravity of the choices he had made. This man, once a respected figure in our community, had become a pariah, not because he was evil or malicious, but because he had struggled to navigate a storm of personal conflicts and social expectations. By the end of our conversation, I still didn't have all the answers, but I understood one thing: Malvi Nazimuddin wasn't the villain that the neighborhood gossip had made him out to be. He was a flawed human being, grappling with challenges that many of us could never fully understand. As he thanked me for listening and prepared to leave, I couldn't help but wonder what his future would hold. Malvi Sahib's voice was heavy with emotion as he continued. "It was the traditions of my family that drove me to leave. When I was a child, I learned of an ancient, bizarre custom passed down through generations. The eldest son of the family was expected to marry a white mare, a ritual said to bring good fortune and protect the family's lineage. I found the practice horrifying and felt it was steeped in ignorance and sin, but speaking out against it would have meant alienation or even worse consequences. From a young age, I carried this burden. My family, including my mother, strictly warned me never to challenge our traditions. Still, the thought of submitting to such a ritual filled me with fear and dread. I couldn't bring myself to accept what they wanted. One night, unable to endure it any longer, I made the decision to leave. I fled our home, our community, and everything I'd known, determined to escape a future I couldn't accept. For days, I wandered aimlessly. I was a child with nowhere to turn, no one to help. Eventually, a kind stranger took pity on me and guided me to a madrasa. There, I met Malvi Feroz, who took me under his wing and gave me a place to belong. In that madrasa, I poured all my energy into religious studies. I saw this as my chance to escape not only the physical chains of my family's customs, but the spiritual ones as well. I vowed to return one day, not as a lost son, but as a learned scholar who could challenge the very foundation of those harmful practices. Over the years, I dedicated myself to becoming a knowledgeable and respected religious figure. I worked tirelessly, gaining recognition for my studies and eventually earning Malvi Feroz's trust. He treated me like a son, even marrying me to his daughter and giving me a new family, a new purpose. But deep down, I still felt the weight of what I had left behind. I never stopped thinking about my parents and my siblings. I knew the scripture and the teachings, how important it is to honor one's parents. The fear that my departure might have caused them pain or worse, brought them shame, haunted me. Even though I could never agree with their traditions, they were still my family. That's why once a week I would slip away to catch a glimpse of them. I didn't have the courage to reveal myself, but just seeing them from a distance gave me some measure of solace. I always returned before anyone could notice. My wife never knew, and I told no one. Now, hearing these words spill out after so many years of silence, I feel both relief and shame. I left to escape a tradition I couldn't accept, but in doing so, I abandoned my family. Even now, I don't know if I'll ever truly find peace. One day, I managed to meet my mother. Embracing her felt like receiving all the comfort in the world. She recognized me instantly, and I could tell how deeply she had missed me. From then on, I visited her every week. I even shared a bit of this with my wife, though I kept it hidden from the villagers. I didn't want my father to find out, fearing it would cause my mother further distress. I had already lost her once and didn't want to lose her again. One night when I went to see her, my father wasn't home. My mother invited me in, insisting I spend the night with her. She was alone as my brothers were at work, and she wanted me to stay just this once. Reluctantly, I agreed. Unfortunately, that same night, my father returned unexpectedly. He was furious to find me there. He wanted nothing to do with me, claiming I had betrayed our family's traditions. He disowned me right then and there. I begged for forgiveness, pleading with him to see reason and abandon these outdated customs. But he remained adamant. He couldn't bear the sight of me. Soon, the entire tribe learned I had returned, and they forced me to leave again. This time, they gave me an ultimatum. If I wanted to be allowed back in the village and see my mother again, I would have to comply with their demands. I realized I was back where I started. If I agreed to their terms, my life would have no purpose. If I refused, I would lose my family again. Finally, I proposed a compromise. I would accept their condition, but only if I could take the white mare with me and strengthen my bond with her. My wife began to suspect that I was hiding something. She thought I might be planning to marry another woman. I couldn't explain everything to her at the time. The elders insisted on a symbolic marriage ceremony, which I underwent. To the villagers, I let it be known that this mare was now my wife. This strange situation quickly spread to the other villages. Even my parents heard of it and were convinced I had indeed married the mare. Eventually, I explained everything to my wife. Under pressure from the villagers, I decided to leave the neighborhood. I didn't want this absurd ritual or the rumors surrounding it to corrupt the children or cause further discord. Quietly, I left and settled elsewhere. For a while, this arrangement continued. Eventually, I returned to my parents and was united with all my loved ones. They accepted my first wife and children as part of the family. One day, I took the mare far away and sold her. Then I dug a temporary grave and spread the news among my relatives that she had died. It was the first time in our tribe's history that a mare who was married to someone had passed away. I gathered everyone and explained that this entire custom was nothing more than a baseless tradition. A hunting accident was simply that, an accident. To claim otherwise or to demand sacrifices and marriages to animals was not only absurd but also a grave sin. At first, many were outraged by my words, but over time, as I presented my arguments, more young men joined my side. Slowly, we managed to eradicate this custom from our tribe. The younger generation began selling their mares and the practice faded. Today, I live happily with my parents and family. I ask you to reveal this truth to our community so that people's misconceptions about me can be cleared. Let them know the real story so that their judgment of me can change.